Ray Dalio, the founder of Bridgewater Associates, the largest hedge fund in the history of the world, a man who managed over $100 billion in assets and spent 50 years studying the cause and effect relationships that drive history, went on X, which most people still call Twitter, and posted something that financial analysts read and then went quiet. He said the United States has entered stage 6 of what he calls the big cycle. Stage 6 is the final stage. It is the violent finale of order collapse characterized by revolution and World War II-like conditions. That is not my description, that is his. From his 2021 book Principles for Dealing with the Changing World Order, in which he analyzed 500 years of human history to identify the 6 stages through which every empire passes. For years, Dalio has been saying America was in stage 5, which he called the pre-breakdown phase, characterized by bad financial conditions and internal conflict. In February 2026, for the first time, he said the United States has transitioned to stage 6. And in case you do not understand what that means in plain language, he wrote in a separate Fortune piece that he believes the times ahead will be radically different from what most people have gotten used to, more like the tumultuous pre-1945 era than what we have experienced since the end of World War II. And he said most people are shocked by what is unfolding in the world right now, but that he is not shocked because he has seen this movie before. He has studied it. He has documented it. He has written 3 books about it, and in early 2025 he used a medical term to describe what the U.S. economy is heading toward. He called it a financial heart attack, and in another interview he described the trajectory as a debt-death spiral. And he is not a doomsayer. He is not a conspiracy theorist. He is the most successful macro investor alive. His track record is documented. His books are bestsellers. His analysis is cited by central bankers and heads of state. And what he is telling every American right now is that the storm that was coming is no longer coming. It is here. And the next few years will determine whether America emerges from the heart attack or succumbs to it. That is what this video is about, not his general views. The specific warnings he has issued in the past 90 days, and what every American family needs to understand about what those warnings actually mean for their money, their jobs, their homes, and their future. The debt-death spiral is the first warning, and it is the one most Americans do not understand because it does not look like a crisis until it ends. America's national debt stood at $38.86 trillion as of March 4, 2026. The Congressional Budget Office projects the federal budget deficit will reach $1.9 trillion by the end of 2026, and the U.S. government is now spending $88 billion per month on interest payments alone on the existing debt. That is equal to the combined monthly spending on defense and education. The interest on what the country already owes now consumes the same amount of money as the Pentagon and the Department of Education combined. And Dalio has described what happens next with the precision of a man who has studied this pattern for 5 decades. He told Fortune that the United States faces a terrible choice. Do you print money or do you let a debt crisis happen? That is a direct quote. And he added that these debts will be paid off by his grandchildren and great-grandchildren not yet born in devalued dollars. Devalued, that is the key word, because Dalio does not believe the U.S. will default on its debt. He said on CNBC the central bank will come in and we will print the money and buy it. And that is where there is the depreciation of money. The dollar in your pocket, in your savings account, in your retirement fund is what pays the debt, not through a default, through depreciation. Every dollar the Federal Reserve prints to buy the debt that the bond market refuses to absorb makes every dollar already in circulation worth less. The debt is not paid by taxpayers. It is paid by savers. And the savers are the elderly, the retirees, the Americans who did the responsible thing their entire working lives, accumulated savings, and plan to live on the purchasing power of those savings in retirement. Those are the people who pay, silently, through inflation, through reduced yields, through the slow erosion of the value of money that happens too gradually to notice in any single month but accumulates into a devastating loss over a decade. And Dalio used Ernest Hemingway's famous line to describe how this ends. Gradually, then suddenly. The debt builds gradually. The interest payments grow gradually. The bond market's willingness to lend at reasonable rates erodes gradually. And then suddenly, without warning, a bond auction fails, or an interest rate spikes, or a foreign holder of treasury debt decides to stop buying. And the gradual becomes sudden, and the sudden becomes a crisis. and the crisis becomes, in Dalio's words, a financial heart attack. China holds approximately $800 billion in U.S. Treasury debt. Dalio has warned that in a Taiwan conflict, that position could be weaponized. BRICS nations are actively pushing de-dollarization. Saudi Arabia quietly canceled the petrodollar agreement that wired the world economy for 50 years. And every one of those developments is a warning light flashing on the dashboard of the U.S. economy. And Dalio has been warning about this for years. But the difference in 2026 is that he no longer says it is coming. He says it is here. The Big Cycle Stage 6. Transition is what no American wants to hear, but every American needs to understand because it is the framework that predicts revolution and civil conflict. Dalio described the conditions that typically combine to produce disorder, conflict, and sometimes civil wars. And what is extraordinary about his description is that every one of them is present in America today. Large debts, deficits, and debasements of fiat currencies led by the dollar, with a rising gold price. Check. Growing political and ideological polarity and populism within countries, now termed MAGA and woke in the United States, arising from large and growing wealth and values differences that are manifest in pre-Civil War type developments. Check. He cited the president's deployments of troops to cities and the related conflicts, such as those in Minneapolis, and the questioning of whether elections will be allowed to proceed as normal. That is Ray Dalio, not a political commentator, a macro investor using his framework to describe the current condition of the United States of America. And on the Leaders with Francine Lacqua interview, he was asked directly whether we could be close to another world war, and he did not hesitate. He said, "We are in wars. There is a financial money war, there is a technology war, there are geopolitical wars, and there are more military wars." Plural, not potential, present tense. And then he delivered the assessment that should stop every American who hears it. He said our power to hurt each other has never been greater. Inside the country, American against American, and he outlined two paths forward. The first, more hopeful scenario is one in which Americans rise above it and realize that our common good is going to necessitate us dealing with it so that what works for most people is going to work. But he admitted that may be a little bit idealistic. The second is far bleaker. He said, "I think these conflicts will become tests of power by each side." Tests of power. That is the language of confrontation, not compromise. And he said this while holding back nothing about what he sees as the probability distribution. The idealistic outcome is possible but unlikely. The confrontational outcome is more likely. And for Americans who have been watching the polarization deepen, the violence escalate, the trust in institutions collapse, and the rhetoric from both parties become increasingly dehumanizing, Dalio's framework is not abstract theory. It is a mirror reflecting the present moment. And the mirror shows a country that has already entered the stage where the historical pattern produces rupture. And I want you to understand the gravity of Dalio making this specific call because of who he is and what he does. Bridgewater Associates, the firm he founded, has made its reputation on being early to macro calls that other investors missed. Dalio was early on the 2008 financial crisis. He was early on the rise of China. He was early on the return of inflation in 2021. His track record on macro calls over 5 decades is documented, and it is one of the most accurate in the history of hedge fund management. When Ray Dalio says, as he did in February 2026, that the United States has transitioned from Stage 5 to Stage 6, he is not offering a theoretical framework. He is placing a bet, a professional bet, with his own money, with his firm's reputation. He has moved Bridgewater's portfolio positioning based on this assessment. He has increased his personal allocation to gold. He has reduced exposure to long-duration dollar-denominated assets. He has spoken publicly about the de-dollarization trend and positioned his public commentary to prepare investors who listen to him. This is not an academic saying something is possible. This is a practitioner saying something is happening, and he has bet his firm on it being right. And the Americans who treat his warning as intellectual curiosity rather than practical guidance are making a different bet. They are betting he is wrong, against a 50-year track record of being right about macro turning points. That is not a bet I would take. And it is not a bet I would recommend any family with savings, retirement accounts, or a home take either. When someone with Dalio's record tells you the pattern is transitioning, the appropriate response is to update your positioning to reflect the information, not to wait for confirmation that arrives only after the positioning is no longer possible. The Strait of Hormuz is the moment that Dalio said will determine whether America retains its global supremacy, and the parallel he drew should terrify every investor in the world. On March 2026, after the U.S. and Israel launched joint strikes on Iran, and Iran retaliated by effectively closing the Strait of Hormuz, which normally handles 20 million barrels of oil per day, Ray Dalio posted on X that it all comes down to who controls the Strait of Hormuz. And he drew a historical parallel that most readers did not fully process. He compared the current moment to the 1956 Suez Crisis, which historians regard as the end of the British Empire's global imperialism. Read that again. Dalio is comparing the current American moment to the moment the British Empire collapsed as a global power, and he was explicit about what he sees. He said even if the United States wins this war, losing trade connections with this critical oil supply chain, roughly a fifth of the world's oil supply flows through the strait daily, will shift the balance of global power irrevocably. Irrevocably. That is the key word, and he outlined three critical factors that could trigger collapse. First, economic deadlock. The unsustainable massive debt burden of the U.S. economy and the steady erosion of the dollar's purchasing power. Second, internal fragility. Deep political polarization and increasing social tensions within the country, leaving the U.S. weak and vulnerable against external threats. Third, attritional wars. High-cost conflicts with regional powers like Iran that drain capital and trust while producing no clear strategic advantage. And Dalio said if all three factors converge, the dollar would lose its status as the global reserve currency. The United States would become unable to finance its debts, and its global power would rapidly evaporate. Rapidly. Not gradually over decades, rapidly. Because when reserve currency status erodes, the erosion accelerates. Foreign central banks that were holding dollars for reserves begin to diversify into other currencies. Oil contracts that were denominated in dollars begin to be denominated in yuan or euros. The petrodollar system that has given the United States the privilege of borrowing unlimited money at favorable rates for 50 years begins to disassemble. And once it disassembles, the United States has to finance its debt at market rates without the global demand that reserve currency status generated. That financing cost would make the current $88 billion per month in interest payments look like a rounding error. And the choice Dalio described would become immediate. Print money or let the debt crisis happen. And printing money in that scenario produces hyperinflation. And letting the crisis happen produces default. And neither outcome is compatible with the standard of living that middle-class Americans have taken for granted for 3 generations. And I want to pause here to make sure you understand the weight of the Suez parallel that Dalio drew, because it is the most historically precise warning he has ever issued. Before 1956, Britain was still widely regarded as a global empire. It had colonies. It had military bases around the world. It had the second most powerful navy. It had a currency, the pound sterling, that was still used in international trade even though the dollar had been rising. When Britain, France, and Israel invaded Egypt in October 1956 to regain control of the Suez Canal that Egyptian President Nasser had nationalized, Britain expected to reassert its global power. Instead, the United States under Eisenhower refused to support the military action. The pound sterling came under attack in currency markets. Britain faced a foreign exchange crisis, and within weeks, Britain withdrew its forces from Egypt. That withdrawal was the moment historians mark as the end of the British Empire. Not because Britain lost a war, because Britain learned that it could no longer act as a global power without the support of the emerging superpower, the United States. The currency crisis exposed the reality that had been hidden by the appearance of empire. Britain was dependent on American goodwill for the stability of its currency, and American goodwill had just been withdrawn. Within 20 years of that moment, Britain had lost most of its remaining colonies, its economy had stagnated, and the pound sterling had lost its privileged position in international trade. The empire that had existed for centuries ended in a matter of years once the currency foundation gave way. And Dalio is telling Americans that the parallel is precise. The United States is Britain in 1956. The Strait of Hormuz is the Suez Canal. The dollar is the pound sterling. And the emerging alternative, whether it is the yen or a BRICS-coordinated currency or simply the loss of dollar monopoly in oil transactions, is the dollar that was emerging then. And the outcome, if the parallel holds, is that the United States will not suddenly become a second-tier power. It will gradually lose the financial privileges that reserve currency status provided. The ability to borrow unlimited money at favorable rates. The ability to impose sanctions that bite because the dollar-denominated financial system is global. The ability to finance deficits that no other country could sustain. All of that erodes, not in 1 year, over a decade. But the erosion begins now, and the Americans who are alive today will live through the transition. The capital war is already underway, and Dalio says it is going to reshape every American's portfolio and retirement account in ways most people cannot imagine. At Davos in January 2026, Dalio told Fortune in a direct quote that the old economic world order is gone. He said, "Let's not be naive and say, oh, we're breaking the rule-based system. It's gone. It's going." That is the founder of the world's largest hedge fund saying publicly, on the record at the World Economic Forum, that the economic order that governed global trade and finance since 1945 no longer exists. And he cited the evidence. Markets entered what he called Sell America mode following President Trump's push for Greenland. The U.S. dollar weakened sharply. The yield on 5-year Treasury bonds rose, signaling concerns about increased government debt supply. And he was explicit about the mechanism. A capital war, which he described by citing the U.S. entrance into World War II when the U.S. froze Japan's assets in an attempt to gain control without military force. He said he sees an analogous situation today among the U.S., China, and Europe. And he specifically warned that there is a red line that has to do with the military as it pertains to Greenland. And if there is a military move, it has capital war implications. Meaning that if the United States attempts military action against a NATO ally over Greenland, the capital response from Europe, China, and other major economies could be severe. Withdrawal of foreign investment, retaliatory capital controls, refusal to hold U.S. debt, freezing of American assets held abroad. And the mechanism Dalio is describing is already operational in ways most Americans are not aware of. China's $800 billion in U.S. Treasury holdings is a weapon that has not yet been fired. BRICS nations have been building parallel financial infrastructure outside the dollar system. Saudi Arabia canceled the petrodollar arrangement that had anchored the global energy market for 5 decades, and the gold price has surged approximately 60% in the past 12 months, which is the clearest market signal that sophisticated capital is preparing for currency instability. Dalio has advised for years that investors hold 10 to 15% of their portfolio in gold. He has been repeatedly asked on television whether this is still his recommendation. His answer consistently is yes. He said in February 2025 on CNBC that people don't have typically an adequate amount of gold in their portfolio. When bad times come, gold is a very effective diversifier. And in his February 2026 comments, he reiterated that in reserve currencies, gold is the second largest reserve currency. He added that monetary policymakers would still call gold the safest money in this kind of environment. That is not a gold salesman. That is the most successful macro investor in history saying repeatedly, publicly, that the conditions he sees require every investor to hold physical gold as a hedge against the currency devaluation he considers inevitable. And the Americans who do not have gold, who do not have diversified portfolios, who have their entire retirement savings in dollar-denominated assets that pay dollar-denominated yields and will be redeemed in dollar-denominated purchasing power, are the Americans most exposed to the capital war that Dalio is warning about. And let me be concrete about what capital war means for an ordinary American's balance sheet. If the dollar loses 20% of its value over 3 years, which is a conservative estimate for what happens during a full reserve currency transition, every dollar-denominated asset you own loses 20% of its international purchasing power. Your Social Security check buys 20% less when you purchase imported goods. Your savings account's purchasing power for any item with an international supply chain component drops 20%. Your retirement account's value measured in real terms declines even if the nominal balance stays the same, and the goods you buy every day, most of which have international inputs, become more expensive. Groceries, because so much food is imported or uses imported fertilizer and fuel. Electronics, clothing, where 98% is imported. Cars, because auto parts cross borders multiple times. Prescription drugs, because the active ingredients are manufactured abroad. Every one of those costs rises as the dollar falls, and the wage that was supposed to cover those costs, denominated in dollars, rises slower than the prices. The only hedge is to hold assets whose value is not determined by the dollar. Gold. International equities, real estate, commodities, companies whose revenue comes primarily from outside the United States. That is the protective structure Dalio has been describing for years, and it is the structure most American portfolios do not have. What you can still do to protect your family in a world where the most experienced macro investor alive has told you the system is breaking. I want to be careful here because Dalio himself is not prescribing panic. He is prescribing preparation. He wrote in his Medium summary that pain plus reflection equals progress, and that the financial heart attack may scar, but it will not kill the prepared. So let me translate his specific recommendations into actions that an ordinary American family can take without moving to a bunker or withdrawing from the economy. First, diversify. Not just across stocks and bonds, across currencies, across asset classes, across geographies. Dalio's recommendation of 10 to 15% in gold is not a get-rich strategy. It is a survive the reset strategy. If the dollar depreciates 30 or 40% over a 5-year period, a portfolio that is 100% in dollar assets loses 30 to 40% of its purchasing power. A portfolio with 15% in gold, which typically appreciates when the dollar weakens, loses significantly less. That differential is the difference between a retirement that maintains purchasing power and one that does not. Second, reduce exposure to long-duration dollar-denominated debt. 30-year Treasury bonds yielding 4% seem safe. But if inflation runs at 4% for a decade because the Federal Reserve is printing money to buy the debt the bond market refuses to absorb, the real return on those bonds is zero. Over 30 years, a 30-year bond held through a period of sustained dollar depreciation can lose 50% or more of its purchasing power. Shorter duration fixed income, tips which adjust for inflation and diversified international bonds reduce that exposure. Third, invest in real assets. Real estate that generates rental income, shares in companies that produce real goods and services that people need regardless of currency conditions. Commodities. These are the assets that retain value when paper money loses it, and Dalio has been explicit that real assets are essential during the systemic changes he is describing. Fourth, maintain a cash reserve but understand what cash is and is not. Cash in a savings account is a depreciating asset during inflation. Cash in a high-yield account that pays above the inflation rate maintains value. Cash in money market funds yielding 4% during a year of 2.7% inflation actually grows. Be strategic. B. Do not hoard cash in accounts paying 0.01%. Move it to accounts that pay yields competitive with inflation. Fifth, and this is the one that most investment advisors will not tell you, protect your ability to earn income in whatever environment emerges. Skills that are valuable during economic stability may not be the skills that are valuable during economic disruption. Diversifying your income sources, developing side businesses, maintaining professional relationships, staying marketable, staying adaptable. All of these are hedges that have nothing to do with financial markets and everything to do with your family's ability to sustain itself regardless of what happens to the currency. And sixth, take Dalio's recommendation about gold seriously rather than dismissively. For most of the last 50 years, financial advisors have dismissed gold as a relic, a barbarous asset, an unproductive investment that pays no dividends. During periods of monetary stability, those criticisms had some basis, but Dalio is telling you that monetary stability is ending. In the era that is beginning, which he has labeled the financial heart attack, gold performs the function that savings accounts and bonds cannot. It holds value. It cannot be printed. It cannot be inflated away. The 60% surge in gold prices over the past 12 months is not a speculative bubble. It is sophisticated capital responding to the same signals Dalio is describing. If you have no gold right now, you are fighting the tide that Dalio, the most successful macro investor alive, has told you is rising. I want to close with something that I think is the most important thing Dalio has said in the past 12 months. In his fortune piece, he described the rise and fall of all monetary orders, political orders, and geopolitical orders as a repeating pattern that typically lasts about 75 years, give or take 30 years. The post-1945 order is 81 years old. It is, by Dalio's framework, due for transition, and the transition is already happening. The question is not whether it will happen. The question is what you will do while it happens. And most Americans, according to every survey and every piece of polling data, are unprepared. Nearly 70% of Americans predict 2026 will be a year of economic difficulty. 3 in 4 are worried about a possible recession. Most do not have gold. Most do not have meaningful international exposure. Most have their retirement savings in dollar-denominated assets. Most believe, because they have been told for their entire lives, that the system will hold. Dalio is telling them directly and explicitly that the system is not holding. It is transitioning. And the transition will have winners and losers, and the losers will be the people who refuse to recognize what is happening until it has already happened to them. The winners will be the people who recognize the pattern, who prepare deliberately, who diversify thoughtfully, and who maintain the financial and psychological resilience to adapt as conditions change. You can be one of those people, but you have to start now, because the big cycle does not pause to let you prepare. It moves forward regardless of whether you are ready. And the final phase, the stage 6 that Dalio has now said the United States has entered, is the phase where the biggest financial shifts happen in the shortest periods of time. What takes a decade to build in stage 3 can collapse in a year in stage 6. What seems permanent in the early stages becomes ephemeral in the late ones. And the Americans who understood Dalio's warning and acted on it will look back in 5 years and say, "I heard him and I listened." And the Americans who did not will ask a question that every generation asks after every preventable catastrophe. Why did we not listen? The answer is, you did not want to hear it, but you have the chance to listen now. Share this video with every family you know, because Dalio is talking to every American, not just to investors. And the investors who understand markets have already taken action. The ordinary families who do not follow financial news are the ones most exposed and most in need of the information in this video. Subscribe and turn on notifications. I am tracking every Dalio statement, every debt milestone, every geopolitical development in real time. No spin, no product to sell, just the pattern recognition of a man who has studied 500 years of history and is telling you what comes next. Because Dalio's record is not abstract. It is documented. He called 2008. He called the China rise. He called the return of inflation. And now he is calling the stage 6 transition. The pattern is consistent. The warnings have been specific, and the time to act on them is before the event, not after. Take care of yourselves out there. Protect your families. Diversify. Prepare. Listen to the man who has studied 500 years of this pattern and is telling you specifically what comes next.